Welcome to Unbox Your World, the podcast where philosophy meets tech. In each episode, we're connecting the dots between philosophy, technology, society, science, and progressive thought. And together with brilliant minds across the world who dare to challenge the way we think and live in today's society, we are unboxing our minds one episode at a time. I am Maria Salting. I am a tech professional during the day and a philosopher at night. So let's get started. Let's unbox ourselves. Welcome back to Unbox Your World by Futurist. In today's episode, we're interviewing the true blockchain expert and crypto professional Ludvig Öberg. He has recently pioneered one of the first theses on management controls within so-called Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, or DAOs, which are members-driven organizations powered by blockchain technologies. Now, blockchain technologies have opened up new possibilities for how we organize ourselves. In the past, it has been challenging to maintain control in a DAO as a number of members grow. However, it is possible to maintain control in these DAOs at scale through using blockchain technologies such as smart contracts, voting rights, and ownerships through tokens, etc. Now, this way, we can avoid the so-called tragedy of the commons, as members this way feel invested when they have clear owner rights and responsibilities. However, is it really possible to maintain a decentralized organization at scale? How do you maintain management control in a large DAO as they grow? And is it even possible to avoid corporate governance, or is this in fact an inevitable must? Well, these are some of the questions we'll dig in today. So tune in to hear more about his research. So hello, welcome Ludvig Öberg, co-founder of Safello. So I listened to, you had a lecture before about your thesis that you had done on Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, which is quite a specific niche topic these days. But so to start off for the listeners, first things first, what is really a decentralized autonomous organization, or DAO as we call them? Like how would you describe it to your grandmother?
DAO is kind of a new word that is forming. So there is not really any formal definition. So it's a bit ask different people, get different answers. But at least the way that kind of we view it from the thesis perspective is it's a new way of organizing people towards a common or shared goal, and where it's done completely, or at least partially, digitally. So you vote on initiatives or proposals through digital means. You have your treasury or funds through digital means with cryptocurrencies, and you use these means to further the cause towards a shared goal. And it can be in the form of more of a company that's for profit, but it could also be a non-profit organization or just a community. So it's a quite broad word. I think if you look at kind of the key things, it would be this connection to cryptocurrencies and also voting on a blockchain using digital signatures. I would say those are kind of what stands out as what is shared in the different definitions that we found.
And I mean, because what it all comes down to, right, is to how do we organize humans, which is a digital way of doing that. But what are the benefits of, doing it through the DAO way and not just organizing people according to the regular management schools?
One thing that was common in all the DAOs that we looked at is that they did not have a physical headquarters anywhere, no location in one country or one city. Instead, it was more of a global community where people joined from all different kinds of places around the world. So that's kind of unique in that sense. It's usually organizations start, at least when they're small, in one physical place, and is quite local. While here we saw more that people bonded together on a common goal more, and then everyone who were interested in that joined, no matter where they were in the world. So that is a kind of a cool aspect. That's because you can vote digitally, you can work digitally and submit your work, whether that's code or marketing or community management or whatever you're doing for the DAO. You can all do that digitally, and you can also receive and send funds digitally through cryptocurrencies. So you can get paid, and you can pay people from the DAO or buy things from the DAO completely digitally. So you don't really need to have a physical base. And this is quite interesting compared to normal organizations that usually have one physical place where they exist. And they're also not registered in any specific country. And this is maybe more of a topic in itself, if they should or shouldn't be. But at least most DAOs that we looked at did not have a legal seating, or they did not have a place where they were legally registered. They just existed as kind of a community and didn't really have a legal body. So that is also kind of unique, and one can question if that's going to work in the long run, but that's at least how they view themselves right now.
So could you say that the DAO, like a DAO, is enabling people who have common interests to organize themselves across countries instead of just having to, work with people locally? So people that are interested in DAOs can work with each other all across the globe.
Yeah, exactly. And,
on
and
DAOs.
we saw DAOs that looked more like maybe companies where you had almost like shares that gave you some part of some profits in the for-profit ventures. We saw others that was more like a club where you had a token that represented some access to a membership, for example, in a Discord or online community. And we saw non-profits that had like a more of a social driven goal, where they wanted to achieve something, but it wasn't necessarily profit, and your token represented some stake in that, in that you could vote and further that goal. So what these organizations did, or what their goal was quite different, and also how they governed was quite different. All of them had some connection to usually a token or an NFT, something that kept track of who is part of this organization, who has the power and who can take decisions on behalf of this organization. And that is also kind of unique, that usually this could be a membership registry for maybe a non-profit and some kind of association. It could be shares in a for-profit LLC or similarly. But here everything was digital and not connected to a specific legal framework in a specific country.
So, I mean, before we dive in further to your research, I think you were also giving an introduction about some common management controls that we are using today in the real world to influence members of an organization. Would you like to share a little bit more about that with listeners?
Sure. I mean, management control is a quite wide subject. It basically includes everything that can. Control is also kind of hard. It really means like influence in a positive way. Like, how do you get towards your goal, and how do you make an organization move towards that goal together? And it can be anything from like financial incentives, like salaries or bonuses that incentivizes people to reach a goal, for example. But it can also be softer things like norms or symbols, like how do we in this organization act? And that also influences the outcome. So it's quite wide what different things can be included, and in general, these are kind of seen as being both influencing of the way that things develop towards a goal, but also that they influence each other. So you can have both symbiotic, that both lead in the same direction, and you can have conflicting management control. For example, you could have that, I don't know, let's take like the banks as an example. Like, okay, you get a lot of bonus if you take a lot of risk, and then you get paid a lot of money. So that's one incentive. That's one management control system that you have. But then also maybe the norms are, well, we should also be nice towards society and not let taxpayers bail us out, for example. So just an example like how things can conflict in the systems that exist that are trying to control or steer an organization. And then it's interesting to look at these as kind of, they call it as a package. How do these together influence an organization and drive them towards a certain goal? What systems are in place? It can also be things like organizational structure. How are you organized? And Swedish organizations are usually considered to be relatively flat, that we don't have a lot of different levels and a quite flat hierarchy. Anyone can go talk to the boss and it's okay. While maybe in Central Europe, there's a lot more hierarchy where you have a lot more layers in between, maybe the people at the bottom and the top boss kind of, and you can't really go into the top boss office and just complain about something. So that also affects like how does the organization act? What's the system that you're in for the organization? So it's quite a wide-ranging things, and some of them we found relevant for DAOs and wrote a bit about, and some of them we decided to leave outside of the scope because we couldn't really find any interesting observations for.
Cool. So, I mean, you studied a few different type of DAOs. So would you like to share a little bit about the DAOs that you studied and what you learned from doing this and this thesis?
Yeah, so we decided to look at more deeply into each DAO, and instead of trying to prove that something is regularly occurring or to say something about how frequent something is, we decided to look at what exists. How does DAO in general look like in the real world? So we looked at 3 different DAOs more in depth and decided to try to pick DAOs that were as different as possible to each other, to get as a wide range of DAOs to look at. And basically try to find interesting examples of something that were unique with each of them, more than to try to prove any kind of specific thing about DAO as a concept. So that, having that background, 3 might sound like quite a few, but that's the strategy we chose, instead of maybe doing a survey and picking out 100 and just looking at very standardized things. We instead did in-depth interviews mostly with people within the DAO to try to find out how do they govern and how does the management control systems look within these organizations.
Yeah, so I mean, would you like to share those 3
Sure.
DAOs and
Yeah,
how did they behave?
The first one we looked at was DX DAO, and they are trying to develop decentralized financial products. So financial products that exist on blockchains. I think their primary product was a swapping service, so you can swap one cryptocurrency for another. And what was kind of unique with them was that they wanted like radical decentralization. They wanted everything to be decentralized. They did not have any formal leaders, no board, anything like that. Everything was voted on the blockchain, on chain, everything. If they wanted to update their website, for example, then they needed to actually put that proposal on the blockchain and vote on it. So they said that it actually took them up to a month to do an update of the code.
Yeah,
so it was quite slow,
yeah.
And they were like very like, I would say ideologically driven, that they really believed in this decentralization and that they didn't want to cut corners. So they were kind of an interesting aspect. That was kind of an interesting aspect that we looked at. Also, they were kind of balancing between who should have the power in the system, who should govern this organization. And they currently had a system where if you worked for this DX DAO, then you received some tokens as compensation for your work, and you could then use those to vote with. And these were transferable. So they weren't really a financial incentive because you couldn't really sell them. It was more about the people who worked in the organization got paid in influence or in power in making decisions. So that was also a bit different than the other ones that we looked at.
But what happened for them then if they were facing, for example, a crisis when they didn't have time to vote? Was anyone able to step in?
They had some stuff like they had, for example, that a smaller amount of money was allocated to what's called a multi-sig wallet, where basically a subset of the organization could spend it. So like a team could, for example, spend it instead of the whole organization. So that was one thing that they did, is like to make smaller, fast decisions. You can't vote on everything. So then you might instead make a decision to allocate a certain amount of resources to a team, and then that smaller team gets to decide on something. So they had kind of sub-organizations or like teams that could make some types of decisions themselves without asking the larger organization itself. But no CEO, no board, no kind of veto power. Everything was on chain.
Interesting. Because what I'm thinking is, like, let's say that they get a bad mention in media, so they have to do crisis media management. That
they might be able to do. I'm not sure, like, someone needs to have access to the social media, for example. So I guess they could go out with a statement and so on. So like those things they could probably do. And what we also learned is while there were no formal leaders, there were informal leaders. So there were people who had a lot of influence and could sway things, even though they weren't formal. They didn't have a formal role. They could still have a lot of influence over people.
Were they anonymous, or?
It was a bit mixed. I would say more of the people in this DAO were anonymous than some of the others we talked to. And what was common with all of these DAOs is that all of them used like online forums, so Discord primarily, together with like a proper discuss forum online. And there, most people were represented only by an alias. Then they might be known by the real name by the people they work with. But if you were just contacting them, it was like an alias you were contacting. And not like we didn't. Some people, I don't think we actually knew their real name either. They didn't tell us, so we just knew them as like their alias, which in a normal organization would be a bit weird. But here it was kind of, that's how it is, kind of internet culture, and especially in crypto, where some people want to be anonymous for various reasons.
Okay, interesting. So that is the more the extreme end towards decentralization.
And then another one we looked at was a company or an organization called Index Coop. And they also built financial products, but focused more on kind of similar to ETFs in the normal financial industry. So you want to invest in a certain basket of currencies or assets, and you can then pool your money to buy those assets in a way, and then you get a share of that pool instead. So that's what they did. Like if you want to invest in a certain cryptocurrency trend, for example, they had an index for that you could invest in directly, and then that smart contract would in turn invest in the underlying assets. So,
and what is an ETF?
Traded fund? It's basically like a index fund, which maybe people know about, but instead of it's tradable, so your share in it can be traded. So they did that on the blockchain basically, and were developing this product, and they were quite different. They had more formality in the organization, so they had like a board of 7 people who would take strategic decisions and had a lot of influence. They were elected by the larger organization, but were given larger mandates than other people. And then they also had different teams, and with formal team leaders who were in charge of that. And a lot of these different DAOs also name these things different things, like squads and pods and nests, and so everyone has different names for these things. But in all of the organizations, we saw some kind of divisions and teams because I guess when you grow, you kind of need to divide yourself. Who's going to be in charge of marketing and who's going to be in charge of this? And then even though you might not have a formal team leader, you have some kind of structure at least, even though you might not want to call it a hierarchy. No one wanted to say that they were a hierarchy. It was like a word they were allergic against. There was no formality, but then we actually looked at how things worked in the day-to-day, then there at least was some informal hierarchies.
Yeah, well, this sounds more like a startup.
Yeah, I would say so. And this also developed over time, that originally they didn't have this board, but then they were like, no one has time to look at these long-term decisions, like where are we going, what should we focus on. They also had the issue of like resource allocation. I think to begin with, they had that every team basically proposed a budget, and then everyone voted on the budget. But there was an issue of like, kind of, if you vote on my budget, I'll vote on your budget. So the whole organizational budget started going up a lot, and they were starting to be fear running out of money. And then they had like, okay, now we need a financial kind of division. So they got some people to have a financial division, and then those people got to approve the budgets, for example. So it's like this, while the DXDAO, they might have like tried to find some other way of doing it, like more voting and more decentralization to solve their issues. In this scope was more pragmatic. They were like, okay, but if we need someone who can keep track of all the budgets, then let's just form a team, and they get that as a task. So they looked more like, as you said, a normal startup or a more traditional company structure.
Which is why you need a CFO.
Yeah, basically. So they wouldn't call it CFO, but they would call it that it's like the lead of that nest, as they call it, that division. So they had more of a traditional like hierarchy and a more traditional organization structure than the XDAO. And that was also why it was kind of interesting to look at. They were also a lot bigger. I think if I remember on top of my head, the DXDAO were about 30 people, and in this scope, I think we're almost 100. So one of our theory also is that it's easier to be decentralized and to do this kind of stuff when you're a small organization. And as you grow, it becomes more and more difficult to coordinate. And then you start to centralize some aspects and create more of a hierarchy or more of an organizational structure to deal with the complexity. That is kind of one of the things that we stipulated.
Which is what happens in the real world.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the one other way that we saw that people try to deal with, we didn't really have seen a successful example, is to split into subgroups. So if you come too many, then you just split into more and more smaller teams, but then you still have the problem, how do you overall coordinate those sub-DAOs? It's still quite difficult, I would say. So yeah, I'm not sure if that would actually work more than in theory.
But if if they were more, centralized, like what was their main reason or motivation to being a DAO instead of a regular organization?
Yeah, I think there was a couple of things. One was this global aspect that anyone can join and it's open. Then when we talked to people, one of the things that motivated them was that they felt involved and that they could affect the outcome of the organization, that they could buy these tokens or be rewarded with these tokens from their work that they could vote with and affect the kind of outcome. They also had that basically anyone can post a proposal. If you think there's a need for a new role within the DAO, you could just post a proposal saying, hey, I'm Ludvig, I want to do this thing, I have this experience. And they could be like, people don't like the word employed when we talk to them, but kind of employed or being consultant or have a certain mission. So anyone can basically suggest anything, which they also thought was quite inspiring. So the people involved at least thought that this was quite different from a normal company, that they didn't have a classic boss and this classic hierarchy. And while there were some hierarchies, it was mostly informal and mostly elected. Though one can question like how much investors versus people working in the project had control, and that was different, I think, between different projects that we looked at.
I mean, yeah. So to me, it sounds kind of like a tool to enable that, democratization. Or, I mean, there's different ways to involve people and reward them, right? But this is like a more scalable tool to do that than collecting feedback through surveys and keep track of who contributed.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing that maybe Index Coop didn't care so much about, but the first one we looked at, the DXDAO cared about, was this kind of censorship resistance, that there's no formal leader to go after, there's no company to go after. They didn't even have a normal domain. Instead, they use something called ENS, which is a decentralized domain. They didn't have their code on GitHub where it could be shut down. Instead, they have it on people's individual accounts spread out, for example. So they were like more focused on that no one should be able to shut us down, and it should be difficult to kind of destroy what they're building. While I would say Index Coop maybe cared less about that aspect and cared more about kind of the organizational aspects, and that they felt that it was a freeing way of organizing.
And you studied the third DAO
that
as well,
was
right?
This ENS DAO, so Ethereum Name Service. They're the ones who develop a protocol to allow for domains, basically the .dns domain, to be registered on Ethereum. And why we chose this is because they have kind of already developed their product. They have this protocol, it's functional, it's being used. So they have maybe a slightly different role as a DAO. They're not developing a new product and trying to find customers. They're just kind of maintaining and being a steward of this protocol. So that was one aspect. The other aspect was that they actually have a legal entity. So they are registered as a foundation. And then the actual development takes part in another company. I think it was the foundation, was registered in Cayman Islands, if I remember correctly. And I think the development organization in Singapore, if I remember correctly. But they had a legal body and a legal entity, which we thought was quite interesting. And the way they did it is that they have a formal board and that formally takes the decisions, but then they also have an advisory board in the form of the DAO. And then the statutes of the foundation say that the board should follow the advisory board, the DAO, then the recommendations. So that was kind of their way of connecting the DAO ecosystem to this legal ecosystem through this foundation with an advisory board. That was quite interesting, we thought, as a way of kind of making DAOs work in the legal world.
So the DAO should follow the advisory board from the actual company.
So the DAO is the advisory board, and the real formal board should follow the DAO. So if the DAO votes on something, then that is recommended by the advisory board, who then hopefully the board of the foundation follows if they follow the statutes. So that was kind of one of the ways to, because one thing that we looked at is like, it's quite difficult to like pay salaries, rent office, like buy physical things when you don't have any legal entity. Also, we discussed with some like, what are the tax implications? If you're working for a DAO, you don't have a counterparty. How do you know what VAT you should pay, or who should pay employment tax, and all these different kind of questions when you don't have a counterparty? So sometimes it's quite useful to have a counterparty, whether it's a foundation or similar setup. So we thought that was quite interesting, that they were like both not developing a product, more being kind of a maintainer, more of a governing a protocol, and also this legal aspect that actually had tried to become a legal entity and interact with it, which the others had not.
That's interesting. I mean, that doing it that way is a way of, like, in this transition period before DAOs even have legal status, that's a way for them.
Yeah, exactly. And we didn't look specifically to the legal aspects. That's not our strength, but it was interesting at least that they were trying to do this, and it was quite different. At the time, I had not heard about a lot of other DAOs who had done something similar. So that was quite interesting.
Actually, I have one example. Someone I interviewed in this podcast before who's building like a system for liquid democracy, so you can give you can vote. I can give my vote on unemployment politics to my mom. I can give my vote on healthcare to someone I believe has good opinions, etc. But apparently, they have implemented that in practice as well by the representative of the parliament in the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken, votes like what people on the voting platform are saying he should vote on. So yeah, it's super interesting.
Yeah, and we saw some parallels to that, also that we discussed that you can kind of see this, the DXDAO, who were kind of more extreme decentralization, they were more like a direct democracy, where everyone could be involved directly in the decisions, while Index, Coop, and ENS as well, they both had some way of the kind of delegating your vote, or more of an elective or electoral democracy system. So that was quite interesting to. We discussed that a bit in the thesis as well. That parallel.
Interesting. And I think you mentioned that as well, and I found it very interesting what you were saying, that it's the obviously as the organization grows, that you need to somehow kind of manage the organization, so you implement a little bit more control. And I think you said something that one of the findings is that the DAO, what's it called? It evolved more and more towards like a typical corporate governance structure, right?
Yeah, that is at least one observation that we did, is that it seems like the larger the organization becomes, the more similar to a normal LLC or similar they've also become. And we even saw people like brainstorming how to solve some of these issues they had, and kind of came up with like, what if we have these people who can just take like strategic decisions for us? And they were almost like, at some point we were kind of thinking like, they're just creating like a LLC, like they're recreating something that already exists. And maybe that shows why kind of the LLC has been so popular over I think it's like hundreds of years. So this is quite interesting. I mean, you have something new there, but then also when you start to struggle, then I think it's easy also to reach towards the known as well. Yeah. So I mean, do you think? I mean, people in the DAO world typically, that a lot of their values is decentralization. But as these organizations grow with more thousands, millions of members, like, do you think, is it inevitable that this transition towards a corporate governance structure happens, or do you think that it can remain? Like, what are your thoughts? Like, is it a necessary evil, or as the organization becomes large enough? I don't think it's a necessary evil, but we definitely saw some trade-offs between like speed of decision making and execution versus decentralization. That if you looked at, for example, DXDAO, they were a bit frustrated that any decision they make takes such a long time to formalize, and that I guess was solved by by having this more electoral or delegating of power to make faster decisions.
Really,
but that also means that you're trusting this person to represent you, kind of. So we saw that trade-off between like some speed
and also, if you like this episode, please don't forget to subscribe. So that's like one aspect, and then we also saw the size versus decentralization. That the larger they are, the slower in general your decision-making becomes. And if you're then trying to be completely decentralized, it becomes even slower. If you're imagining that you're like a really big company, you have 10,000 employees and 100,000 shareholders, for example, and every one of those should be able to vote on
every single decision you make, whether you should launch this product or not. And you can imagine just the logistics of running that organization in a kind of DAO way would be really massive.
Yeah.
Because you want everyone to have their voices heard, so you want to wait for everyone to have a chance to vote and to comment and to discuss. But that also means that you have to give it, weeks, months to take any decisions. So I think to some sense it makes sense to delegate decisions, and then it's a question about, can you delegate power while keeping it decentralized? And there, like, I think this multi-sig wallet is quite interesting, that you can like allow certain amount of resources to be spent in a more centralized way while keeping the larger treasury, the larger amount of resources with the collective instead. And with like smart contracts and kind of coded rules, you could create some interesting aspects, I think. And I think that hasn't really been explored completely yet. I think we're just kind of at the start. So if I'm being positive, that's my comment. But then I also see this kind of general trend that it's easy to just be a bit lazy and just like, we'll just centralize a bit more then, and we'll elect a board and a CEO who can take all these difficult decisions away from us, kind of.
Yeah. So, I mean, looking ahead then, where do you where do you see the development go with DAO, or what are you interested in? What do you hope for?
I think that, where we see that this makes the most sense, at least from what I've viewed and kind of where we stand today, is that more kind of short-term project-based organizations that are global and have kind of a shared goal, where you want to achieve something fast without a lot of bureaucracy, then I think DAOs make a lot of sense. I know, for example, there was a DAO to raise funds for Julian Assange, for example, that we looked at a bit. And then they kind of just put up a DAO, put up a multi-sig wallet, elected some people who controlled that wallet, who were like trusted by the community, and then said, okay, donate your money here and you will get some tokens to vote on what we're going to do with those funds. And then it was decided that some was going to spend on, I think, primarily legal defense of Julian Assange, for example. So that was like an example of like, okay, let's form an organization very quick. We have a short-term goal. We have a very clear goal. It's not a local issue, it's a global issue, and we don't want to create a kind of traditional organization for it. So let's just do a DAO and vote on it. And all the funds were cryptocurrencies, and all the proposals and decisions were made using digital signatures. So it's like a very easy, and then you can just, you don't really have the issue of scale so much, because it's quite clear what you're doing. I think it's more when you're trying to be like a for-profit, more product-based company, that I think it is more difficult. You have competitors who might not be a DAO, and you need to compete with those, and they take fast decisions, they go to market fast, and so on. So then there needs to be like a innovation like power or something that motivates why you would want to be a DAO, and I think that's less clear to me. But for this like more short-term project-based, or these that need like this censorship resistance, where they're worried about being taken down or government action against them, then it might make sense to form these type of organizations, more than your traditional startup. I would say that's at least my opinion.
I feel like this could also give, for example, young people a vote to engaged in climate and these kind of things.
I definitely think that these types of like more social issues, or like where you're trying to drive a cause, are quite interesting, because you're both a member and a voice of that cause, and you can also influence kind of what you're spending resources on. You can be part of the decision making that you might not be with like a traditional NGO, for example. Then you might just donate funds and maybe help with some tasks, but you might not be in charge of the actual decisions being made. So I think from that perspective, it's quite interesting, seeing it as kind of a direct democracy movement, basically.
Do Do you think that like DAOs could become mainstream for like charities to use?
I think the difficulty is like the legal aspects, and also that the tools aren't really there yet. So we saw that a lot of the DAOs were still trying to find like what tools should we use, like how should we compensate people, for example, was something they spent a lot of time thinking about. Some of them tried to use like everyone votes how much they think everyone else should earn, for example, like what contribution everyone else have made. That was like one way. One way was doing like bounties, where you like say, okay, if someone does this, then they get a certain reward and so. So I think there the tooling didn't really exist yet. And same thing with this like smart contracts with rules to like delegate resources and decisions didn't really exist either. So I think that needs to come in place, and then also the legal system that people involved in a DAO should feel safe from legal action, basically, if something goes wrong. And I don't think that's the case from what I've understood so far. So I think it is a bit of a early stage, and I think that's also a bit why we were interested in the topic, just because it is like a start of a new kind of trend that's coming up in cryptocurrencies, and it's interesting to follow and kind of see how it develops in the future.
I guess so. I guess like anyone can do a crowdfunding campaign at Kickstarter. I think it's called Kickstarter, right? I guess if someone creates a tool, which probably will happen, I mean, in the future, for creating these kind of things in a DAO world, then it will be easy.
Yeah,
for
and I mean, then you want to add like digital voting and kind of tokens for decision making and stuff, and then you, I mean, so the components kind of already exist, even though the tooling might be a bit lacking. So I don't think it's completely impossible, and especially if I can imagine like if you're trying to, I don't know, fund, for example, women's rights in Iran, for example, then you might not be able to operate in Iran as a normal NGO would. It might not be allowed by the state. But to then have like a DAO instead, for example, where you can get funding, where you can discuss and vote anonymously and form a community that way could be, for example, one example where it might not be possible to do with today's organizational framework, but might be possible with the DAO. So I think there's a lot of different interesting kind of use cases. It's more about, I'm not sure if like the classic startup is a good fit for DAOs. I think it's more like other types of organizations that it might be more important to have these characteristics that the DAO has.
I feel like what you're saying, also reconnecting to what you say in the beginning, I feel like it's very much like when there's a very strong common interest, it might be a very good fit.
Yeah, and we saw that as well on some where it's like some of them I think all of them had some kind of constitution, that they had some kind of like governing rules that like this is what we should do, this is how we should behave, this is who we are basically. As kind of and then everyone who joined needed to approve that constitution, to agree on those common rules. So that was also quite interesting, that you have this shared set of goals and also like a feeling of a belonging, and that's based on this shared rule set. And I think, as you say, then it is quite important that you have something clear that you're going towards, with maybe the exception of these kind of more social clubs that we didn't look at anyone in depth, but we noticed that there were, for example, if you bought an NFT, then you could access to a certain social club and you could vote on the events that the club should have. Then, well, I guess then the goal is to hang out and have a nice time and do whatever that club does. So I guess that's a goal too, but they weren't as concrete of like, this is the vision, wasn't really as concrete. Then it was more the people who maybe were the important part.
Interesting. If anyone is interested in, learning more or reading more, can they do that somewhere?
Yeah, sure.
Should they reach out to
me? Ludvig Öberg on most social media, and You can also, if you want to read 113 pages, you can download my thesis from Linköping University, if you really want to. Otherwise, there's a lot of good information online about DAOs. Like, we actually struggled with that we don't really have many formal sources in our thesis, because there's almost no academic papers on this. Very few. And I think we found like 3 or 4 at all on the topic about anything with DAOs, and particularly nothing on management, control, and DAO. So most of the things are online, and I think that's also like crypto people, like, they don't write academic papers in general. They write on Medium and on Twitter. And so I think that's where you should look if you want the most up-to-date information. And then there's a lot of like other, so people who build tooling and products for DAOs. So there's even like that level. There's like companies who build tooling and stuff for DAOs, and they have a lot of information as well. Like, I think one of them is called Aragon, for example, where you can read up about a lot of like how does DAO works and what exists and so on. So that might also be useful.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining. It's been a really interesting conversation. That's it for today. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. And if you want to read up more about the guest, then you can go to the show notes to get all of the links. And also, if you like this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter to never miss the latest episode. Thank you for today. See you in the next episode.